There's a kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. It doesn't live in the muscles. It sits deeper than that, in the place where a person keeps their hope. Most people never recognize it on someone else's face. They just think that woman looks a little quiet. But a man who has carried it on his own shoulders for years spots it from the other end of the train car. That night, sleet came at the city sideways, and the 11:40 Market Frankfurt train ran above Philadelphia like a thin thread of yellow light stitched through the dark. The last car was nearly empty. In the rear seat against the bulkhead, a man sat with his back to the wall and his eyes half closed, his calloused hands still dark with motor oil, wearing the faded suede jacket of a mechanic coming off a night shift. At his feet lay a heavy ash-gray dog, still as a stone, breathing so slowly and so deeply you could feel it come up through the floor. Nobody in that car sat near them. 3 nights a week, for 3 years, that man rode this exact train, sat in that exact seat, and never told a living soul why. At Girard Station, the doors opened, and a young woman stepped aboard with 2 bags, one holding a nurse's uniform, one holding medicine. She sat down with her back straight, the way people sit when they've endured so long they've forgotten they're enduring. Then the train stopped at Somerset. The doors opened again, and 3 young men came in on a gust of cold air and the smell of cheap beer. They were loud from the moment they hit the steps, but it wasn't the happy noise of men heading home from a good night. It was the sharp, jagged noise of men hunting for someone to take it out on. They walked past dozens of empty seats in the cars ahead and chose the last one. They started with an old woman counting coins in the palm of her hand. The whole car looked away. Only 2 people didn't. Those 3 thought they'd picked on a tired mechanic and an old dog that night. They were wrong about nearly everything. If this story reached you, leave a like so I know you're still listening. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories every week. And if someone in your life needs to hear this one tonight, send it to them. That man didn't need to look around to know there were 3 people in the car. He'd counted them from the moment he stepped aboard, and he counted again every time the doors opened, not because he was worried, but because it had long ago become the first thing he did, as natural as a heartbeat, as natural as breathing. 3 people, 2 doors. 3 meters to the connecting door at the rear of the car, 4 meters to the side door. The latch on the connecting door had been loose since the previous winter. One hard push with the shoulder would open it, and he knew that because he'd tested it once on a night when no one else was there. People said that after a man left the military, everything would settle down on its own with time. 12 years in Team 3 had taught him that people only said such things because they'd never been there. The part of his mind that measured distances and counted exits never rested. It merely lowered its voice a little, just enough for him to live with it, and on nights like this one, it spoke rather loudly. He reached out with his thumb and tapped twice against Brutus's leather collar. The dog didn't lift its head. It only shifted one ear slightly backward, a movement so small that no one else in the car noticed, then continued breathing in that same slow, heavy rhythm. 2 taps meant I'm still here, everything's fine, stay down. 7 years earlier, Brutus had needed treats to learn that. Now he knew before August's fingers even touched him, and sometimes August wondered which of the 2 was keeping watch over the other. The engine oil beneath his fingernails was real engine oil, not something smeared there for appearance, because that afternoon he'd spent 3 hours beneath a 16-year-old truck, whose owner should have sold it long ago, and because there were afternoons when tightening a bolt to exactly the right torque was the only decent thing he managed to do all day. When the train crossed the joint between 2 sections of rail, the entire car jolted, and something very slight passed across his face before disappearing at once, so slight that a person would have needed to stand within half a meter to see it, and no one on this train ever stood that close to him. He sat with his back against the wall of the car, always the wall, never the back of a seat, and he could no longer remember what year he'd begun choosing to sit that way. What he did remember was the comfort of knowing that there was nothing behind him but steel, while everything he needed to see remained in front of him. Some people might have called it an illness. His doctor had a 3-letter name for it, written on a piece of paper August still carried in his wallet, and that piece of paper was the most honest thing in the wallet. He chose the last car not because it was empty, though it was. He chose it because the camera mounted in the front corner of the ceiling had been broken since October. Its tiny red indicator light had gone dark the day strong winds brought a tree branch down onto the tracks near Erie, and no one at the transit company had seen any reason to repair it. He knew that. He hadn't guessed. He'd checked twice, 3 weeks apart, the way a man did when he'd survived his entire life by checking everything twice. Nothing in this car was being recorded. No faces were being saved. To most people, that detail would have meant nothing. To him, it was the entire reason he was still permitted to sit there like a mechanic at the end of his shift, rather than exist as a name inside someone's file. For 3 long years, this was his only routine. No car, no companion, no phone in his pocket, only sleet striking the glass, the sound of iron wheels grinding against the rails, and a dog weighing nearly 70 kilograms stretched out at his feet. Some people needed alcohol to make it through the night. He needed a train that ran on time. At Girard Station, the doors opened, and the girl stepped aboard. He registered her the way he registered everything else, no more and no less, and he intended to leave it at that. But there was one thing he couldn't shut out, and it wasn't on the list of things he counted. It was the way people sat down. There was a certain posture he'd seen in young soldiers on the 3rd night of a long assignment, the posture of someone who had run out of places to set anything else down and still kept their back straight because they believed that if they let themselves collapse even once, they'd never be able to rise again. He saw that posture in the girl carrying 2 bags, and he looked away. It wasn't his concern. He reminded himself of his own unwritten rule, a sentence worn smooth from being used too often. One he recited in his mind the way other people said a prayer before a meal. Don't get involved in anything. Don't look at anyone for longer than 2 seconds. Don't help anyone. Don't remember anyone's face. Just go home. Bridget Halloran had just left St. Ambrose Hospital after 16 hours, and she had reached that state every night shift worker knew, the state in which the body kept moving normally, while some part of the mind had already fallen asleep 2 hours earlier. The first thing she did when the train began to move wasn't lean back against the seat. She took out her phone and called home. She always called before doing anything else, because if she waited any longer, she would fall asleep. And if she fell asleep, Mrs. Dolores would stay awake waiting for her. Dolores Kearns answered on the 2nd ring, just as she had the previous 700 times, with the sound of a radio playing behind her voice. Rowan was still awake. He was listening to the afternoon game for the 2nd time, and he insisted that this time he was listening for analysis, not entertainment. He had eaten all his dinner, including the beans. Mrs. Dolores added in the voice of someone who had just won a difficult negotiation, and he had said that if the shop on the corner of Allegheny was still open, his sister was to remember to buy donuts, the powdered kind rather than the glazed kind, because according to him, glazed donuts were for people who didn't understand anything about donuts. Bridget laughed. It was the first laugh that had come out of her in 16 hours, and it escaped a little louder than she intended, loud enough that she raised a hand to cover her mouth and glanced around. She told Mrs. Dolores to go to bed, that she would be home in 40 minutes, and that she shouldn't wait by the door. Mrs. Dolores said she would wait by the door. The two of them had had this conversation about 100 times, and Bridget had never won once. She ended the call and kept the phone in her palm for another moment, letting the warmth of the conversation remain with her a little longer. Then she reached for the breast pocket of her uniform. The envelope had been there all day, through 3 changes at the nurse's station, through the 2 times she had needed to sit beside a child's bed and tell the parents the words no one ever wanted to hear, through the lunch she had eaten standing up in 4 minutes. It was still there, flat and light, and she had already read it 3 times that day. She opened it and read it for the 4th time. The words on the page hadn't changed. At the top was the company's name, Meridian Recovery, printed in a typeface that looked very much like the kind used by respectable places. In the middle of the page was a number she had memorized, $61,000, and beneath it was another number, 14 days, after which the case would be transferred to the legal department. At the bottom was a line in smaller print stating that the company looked forward to hearing from her and was always willing to discuss available assistance options. She had called them twice to discuss those assistance options. The first time, she had waited 38 minutes. The second time, she had waited 51 minutes. And then a man with a very courteous voice had explained that her case had reached a stage at which those options were no longer available, and he had thanked her for calling. Bridget folded the letter along the same 3 creases, slipped it back into the envelope, returned it to the breast pocket of her uniform, and straightened her back. She didn't sigh. She didn't look out the window. She simply sat upright with both hands lowered, and her face returned to the exact expression that would tell anyone who happened to glance across the car only one thing, that a young woman had just finished her shift and was on her way home. In the row of seats against the wall behind her, the man saw more than that, But he didn't see what he should have seen. He couldn't read the envelope, couldn't hear the phone call beyond a few scattered sounds buried beneath the grinding of the iron wheels, and had no intention of finding out. He noticed only one detail, the way he noticed doors and distances. Not because he felt sorry for her, but because that part of his mind had no switch to turn it off. The girl held the phone in her left hand. Throughout the entire call, while she read the letter, and even while she folded it again, her right hand never left the second bag resting on her lap. She wasn't gripping it tightly. She wasn't holding it to keep it from falling. Because the train was running smoothly, and the bag had handles. She was supporting it. Her hand rested beneath the bottom of the bag, curved upward, keeping it from pressing against her knees every time the car jolted. He had seen people carry things that way before. People held something like that when it was worth more than everything else they carried, or when it didn't belong to them, when they were only keeping it safe for someone else, and would have to answer to that person if it broke. The other bag, the one containing her uniform, she had allowed to slide onto the floor beside her feet the moment she sat down, and she hadn't looked at it again. The man noted that detail, set it aside in his mind, and looked away. It wasn't his concern. There was a reason Bridget always called home before leaning back against the seat, and the night before had shown her exactly what that reason was. She reached the door at 1 o'clock in the morning, turned the key as slowly as she could to keep the hinge from squeaking, took off her shoes in the hallway, and walked barefoot into the kitchen like a thief inside her own home. The kitchen light was on. Rowan was sitting at the table with the radio in front of him, its volume turned down as low as it would go, and he didn't look as though he had been caught. He looked as though she was the one who owed an explanation. He said he had been waiting for her for 2 hours because something very important had happened, and the important thing was that he needed a witness, because at 8 o'clock that evening he had predicted a hit in the game 3 seconds before it happened, and without a witness, the entire city of Philadelphia would never know about it, which meant that, by coming home late, his sister had directly sabotaged his career. Bridget managed to keep a straight face for about 2 seconds before she burst out laughing, the kind of laughter she had to cover with her hand, because Mrs. Dolores was asleep in the next room. She took out 2 bowls. It was something that never needed to be said, because in this house, 1 o'clock in the morning meant cereal. It had meant cereal for years, ever since she was 19, and didn't know how to cook anything except noodles. And the ritual had outlived even their old house on Tioga Street. She poured cereal into both bowls, then opened the refrigerator and took out the milk. Rowan leaned forward, lifted his fist to his mouth like a microphone, and lowered his voice into the slow, rumbling tone of the commentators on the radio, a voice he had practiced until it sounded almost real. He said, "Dear listeners, tonight at Halloran Stadium, we are witnessing a historic pouring of milk. The pitcher has been holding the carton for 30 seconds and still hasn't made a decision. The tension in this kitchen is beyond description. And oh, there it is. She's pouring. She's gone too far. Ladies and gentlemen, much too far. A disastrous pour that we'll be discussing for years to come." Bridget really did pour too much, because she was laughing and her hand was shaking. The milk spread over the rim of the bowl. Rowan lowered his fist and announced that he had made up his mind. He was going to become a baseball commentator, not on television but on the radio, because on the radio people had to describe every single thing they were seeing, and he said that was much harder, and he liked difficult things. Then he told her about the St. Brendan Center, about a man who worked there named Whitaker, who had insisted on calling him Ronan for 5 straight months, and how Rowan had decided to stop correcting him and let it continue for the rest of his life, because by then it had become funny. The 2 of them finished their bowls of cereal at 1:20 in the morning. Neither of them mentioned money. Neither of them mentioned any paperwork, or anything heavier than Mr. Whitaker and a disastrous pouring of milk. It wasn't because they were avoiding those things. It was because there was an agreement in that house that no one had ever spoken aloud, an agreement that the kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning was a place where such things weren't allowed to enter. Before Bridget sent him back to his room, Rowan told her that if she came home late again the following night, she would owe him 2 acts of witnessing, with interest. She said she knew. He told her to get some sleep, his voice already blurred by a yawn, and that was what a 16-year-old boy said to his sister at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and she stood in the doorway listening to him before turning off the kitchen light. Tonight, in the last car, besides Bridget and the man seated in the row against the rear wall, there were 3 other people. Mrs. Iola Bendix sat in the second row from the front door, a netted shopping bag resting on her knees, and she was counting the loose change in her palm. The first time, she counted with her index finger, pushing each coin to one side as though arranging seeds. The second time, she counted more slowly, her lips moving along with the numbers. Then she counted a third time, and on the third count, she moved very slowly, with the particular slowness of someone who still hoped the final amount might somehow be different from the first two. It wasn't. She closed her fingers around the coins, keeping the money clenched in her palm instead of putting it into her bag, and looked out the window, where there was nothing to see except sleet and the low rooftops passing beneath the elevated tracks. 4 rows away from her, a boy of about 15 sat pressed toward the window, with a pair of large headphones covering both sides of his head. He wasn't playing music loudly. Anyone could tell because no sound leaked from them, and because he didn't tap out a rhythm or move along with anything at all. The headphones weren't there for listening. They were there to tell the entire train that he wasn't really present, that he couldn't hear anything, that no one should try to speak to him, and anyone who had ever needed to ride a subway alone at nearly midnight, at the age of 15, understood exactly what that trick was meant to do. At the opposite end of the train, inside the narrow cabin at the front, Dennis Pruitt drove the route the way he had driven it for 30 years. He had entered the job at 28, and he would leave it before summer arrived. And during those 30 years, he had learned all kinds of things no one taught in training. He had learned that sleet wasn't as dangerous as freezing rain, that the curve near Erie always demanded more braking force than the figures in the manual suggested, and that the most dangerous thing on this line had never been speed. Speed had a gauge. Speed had brakes. The most dangerous thing was whatever stepped onto the train at the stations after 11 o'clock at night, and against that, all he had inside his cabin was a red button, a radio that often crackled, and a pane of glass. He had pressed that red button 4 times in 30 years. 3 times, the situation had settled itself before anyone arrived. The 4th time was something he no longer told anyone about, not even his wife, and that had been in 1997. The train pulled away from Girard Station and moved onto the straight section of track, and Dennis raised his eyes to the right side rearview mirror out of 30 years of habit, the mirror that showed him the entire length of the train stretching behind him beneath the weak yellow lights. He saw the last car. He watched it for about 2 seconds. Then he lowered his gaze to the clock mounted on the control panel, noted silently that the train was running 1 minute and 10 seconds behind schedule, and reached for the control lever. Bridget was on her knees before she had time to think. The floor of the car was cold and wet, covered with the icy water people had carried aboard on their shoes from the sleet outside, water that had settled into the grooves of the rubber flooring, and she felt it soak through the thin fabric over her knees at once. She didn't notice. The coins had rolled everywhere. Some had slipped beneath the seats, while others had stopped against the metal ridge where 2 sections of flooring met, and she gathered them one by one into her palm, in exactly the same way she gathered everything in a disordered room, after the work was finished, quickly, neatly, without a word. She found 11 coins. She knew there were 11 because she counted them silently as she picked them up. And the part of her mind doing the counting was the same part that counted every pill in a tray before she carried it into a patient's room. She stood, took Iola Bendix's hand, opened it, placed the coins in the center of the old woman's palm, then closed her fingers around them. The elderly woman said something so softly that Bridget couldn't make it out because someone behind her was laughing. She didn't look up. It was something she had learned and practiced through 4 years in the emergency room, the ability to keep her eyes exactly where she wanted them, even when someone was trying to make her look away. But she listened. She heard the voice behind her say, "Oh, look at that, the Saint of Philadelphia," and she heard 2 other laughs join in, one low and throaty, the other higher and more hurried, the sound of someone laughing only because the person beside him was laughing. Then she heard the same voice ask where she worked, and she knew it wasn't really a question. Bridget had faced every kind of person during those 4 years. She had stood in front of men twice her size at 3 o'clock in the morning, men who didn't know where they were, people who had just lost someone they loved and needed to pour that loss onto anyone wearing a medical coat, and she had learned how to speak to them in a level voice that neither rose nor fell, how to keep both hands visible in front of her, how never to let herself be forced into a corner without a way out. She did all of those things now. She turned halfway around, kept her distance, lowered both hands beside her body, and took one very small step backward toward the connecting door at the rear of the car. The kind of backward step no one noticed was a retreat, but there was no one in a medical coat standing behind her here. There was no security guard at the end of the hallway. There was no red button on the wall she could lean her shoulder against. And during that second and a half, she did what anyone would have done, what human beings had done since they first learned to stand. She looked around the train car for someone. The boy wearing headphones didn't look up. Mrs. Iola was bending over her netted shopping bag. Then Bridget's eyes reached the row of seats against the rear wall. She recognized him immediately, and it wasn't because of the suede jacket or the ash-gray dog lying at his feet. She recognized the hand. 6 months earlier, at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the emergency room at St. Ambrose, bed number 7, a man had sat there with his right hand wrapped in an oil-stained shop rag. He had driven himself there. No one had come with him. When she asked what had happened, he said he was a mechanic and had caught his hand in the gear shift of a truck, and she had written exactly that in the medical chart, because that was her job, to record what the patient said. 4 stitches. She remembered the number because she remembered everything. But what she remembered more clearly than the 4 stitches were the things she hadn't written in the chart. That wound hadn't been caused by a gear shift. A gear shift pinched, crushed, and left bruising around the edges, while the wound across his hand had opened in a straight, clean line. The kind of injury a night shift nurse in Kensington had seen often enough not to ask a second time. And he hadn't flinched. Not once, through all 4 stitches. She had injected the anesthetic, but anesthetic needed 4 minutes to take effect, and he hadn't waited 4 minutes. He had told her to go ahead, and she had watched his face through every one of those 4 stitches, because she was waiting for him to flinch so she could stop. He had only stared up at the ceiling light. Tonight, he opened his eyes. He looked at her, and she knew with absolute certainty that he had recognized her too. Then he shook his head, very slightly, only once, a movement meant for her alone, one no one else in the train car saw. Don't say anything. Bridget looked away from the row of seats against the rear wall and answered the first question, because refusing to answer was always worse. She said she worked at a hospital. Her voice was level, neither rising nor falling, neither too polite nor cold. Exactly the voice she used in the emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, the voice that told people, "I'm not afraid of you, but I'm not challenging you either." Curtis Baines stood in the aisle about 2 meters from her, one hand gripping the overhead rail, and he repeated the word hospital in a long, drawn-out tone, as though it were something amusing. Then he asked how much she made in one night working at a hospital, and Petey Gloss let out his high, hurried laugh, while Walt Tremblay didn't laugh at all. Walt simply shifted 1 step to the side, and that step placed him directly between Bridget and the front door. Bridget noticed immediately. She didn't look at Walt. She kept her eyes on Curtis because Curtis was the one speaking, and the person speaking was always the one you had to watch, while the silent one was the one whose position you had to know. She kept both hands visible, lowered at her sides, her palms turned slightly outward. She took 1 very small step backward, timing it with the moment the train car jolted over a rail joint so that it looked as though she had merely lost her balance. She had made that movement hundreds of times. She had done it with a man holding an intravenous pole in the 3rd-floor hallway, with a father who had just heard the news about his child and no longer understood whom he was shoving, with a 20-year-old young man too drunk to stand and yet somehow still standing, and every time she had done exactly 4 things. Keep her voice level, never look away, keep her hands visible, find the door. Those 4 things had saved her more often than anything she had been taught in school, but every time, there had always been a 5th thing she never needed to think about, because it was already there. In the 3rd-floor hallway, Marguerite sat at the nurse's station, and Marguerite could call security in 4 seconds. In the emergency room, a red button was mounted no farther than an arm's reach from every bed. Anywhere inside that building, if Bridget raised her voice even once, 3 people in medical coats would come running because that was the rule, and everyone followed it. None of that existed here. There was no nurse's station, no button, no one in a medical coat. There was only a thick pane of glass at the far end of the train, 5 cars away, and a driver whose face she had never seen. She counted again in her head, and this time the calculation produced no good answer. Curtis stepped forward. He asked why she wasn't answering, and his voice had acquired a new edge, the edge of a man who had just realized that the person in front of him didn't intend to fight back, but didn't intend to be afraid either. That was the thing men like him could tolerate least. Petey said something about her uniform. Walt shifted another half a step. In the row of seats against the rear wall, the man didn't move. He wasn't hesitating. There was a great difference between those 2 things. And if anyone that night had been sitting close enough to see his hands, they would have understood at once, because both hands rested open on his knees, every finger completely relaxed, the posture of a man who was fully prepared and waiting. Inside his mind, the numbers continued to move. 3 men. The one standing closest to her was the one who talked the most, and the one who talked the most was always the least dangerous. The dangerous one was the thin man who kept laughing, because he couldn't stand still, because his hands kept slipping into his coat and coming back out, and people only did that when there was something inside the coat they wanted to use but hadn't yet found the courage to use. The large one had positioned himself in the most effective place in the car, and he hadn't done it because he was intelligent. He had done it because the instinct of the pack had told him where to stand. There was one more thing. If the man stood now, he would be standing inside a train car with 6 people, including an elderly woman in the 2nd row and a 15-year-old boy in the 6th, both of them behind the 3 men, both of them with nowhere to go. He had been inside enough confined spaces to know that the most expensive thing in the world was 30 seconds, and he had only one way to purchase those 30 seconds. He had to wait until the train entered the station, until the doors opened, until there was a way to get people out. The next stop was Huntingdon, 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He watched the girl retreat another half a step toward the connecting door, and he understood exactly what that half step meant. He noted that she knew what she was doing, that she had been inside rooms like this before. 2 minutes and 10 seconds. He didn't move. His thumb rested on the dog's leather collar, not tapping, simply resting there. Petey Gloss was the first to act, and he did it not because anyone told him to, but because he had been unable to stand still for 2 full minutes, and all that restless energy had to go somewhere. He reached out, grabbed the strap of the uniform bag hanging from Bridget's shoulder, and yanked it down. The strap slid hard across the joint of her shoulder with a sharp burst of pain. The bag hit the floor, struck the metal ridge where the sections joined, and Petey laughed, that same high, hurried laugh, then used his foot to shove it farther beneath the row of seats, as though it were the funniest thing that had ever happened on the Market-Frankfurt line. Bridget turned on instinct, and that was where everything went wrong. She didn't turn to reclaim the bag. She turned because her right hand was supporting something else, and the motion pulled her right shoulder with it, and the strap of the second bag, the one she hadn't allowed to leave her shoulder for even a single second during the entire ride, slipped down. No one grabbed it. No one touched it. It simply slid from her shoulder in less time than a heartbeat, and her hand reached for it a fraction of a second too late. The bag fell straight onto the floor of the car. There was the sound of plastic cracking, a small, dry sound that anyone who had ever dropped something important would recognize at once. The sound that told a person it was over, that it couldn't be repaired. The lid sprang open. Then the pills rolled everywhere across the aisle. They followed the slight tilt of the train car, spreading across the wet rubber floor in the shape of a fan, each one flashing briefly as it passed through the pale bands of light from the fluorescent lamps overhead. Some stopped against the legs of the seats. Some rolled farther toward the front door. Others fell into the narrow channel running down the center of the floor, where water from the sleet had gathered in a long, dark streak. Bridget dropped to her knees. She moved even faster than she had when she knelt to gather Mrs. Iola's coins, and this time there was nothing neat or controlled about the way she did it. She snatched up the 2 nearest pills, felt that they were wet, and froze for half a second with the damp tablets resting in her palm because the part of her mind trained as a nurse had just told her something she didn't want to hear. Then she spoke. She said please, and the word that came out of her mouth sounded nothing like anything she had said during the last 10 minutes. It wasn't steady. It wasn't flat. It broke in the middle, the way a cord breaks after being pulled tight for too long. And then she said that it was her brother's medicine. 4 years in the emergency room had taught her how to keep her voice level in front of a man holding an intravenous pole, in front of a father who had just lost his child, in front of almost anything. Those 4 years hadn't taught her how to keep her voice level when the thing at risk belonged to Rowan. The sentence fell into the train car like a stone into water. Petey stopped laughing. Not because he felt remorse, because he hadn't even had time to understand enough to feel remorse, but because the sound of her voice startled him the way an unfamiliar noise startles a person. Walt Tremblay looked down at the floor, looked at the scattered pills, then glanced toward Curtis, the look of someone waiting to be told whether what had just happened was still supposed to be funny. Mrs. Iola Bendix pressed both hands against her netted shopping bag. The boy in the 6th row, the boy who had spent so much effort pretending he wasn't present in that train car, lifted his head and raised one hand to pull one side of the headphones away from his ear. And Curtis Bain, the only one of the three who had enough time to understand what he had just heard, did exactly what a man like him would do when something so real had entered the train car that it made him uncomfortable. He twisted his mouth into a smirk and said something about her brother. In the row of seats against the rear wall, August Vance hadn't stood before the train reached a station in 4 years. For the last 3 years, he had sat in that same place 3 nights a week, and remaining still had become something he practiced, something by which he measured himself, the only proof he had that he was still a man capable of choosing to do nothing. Huntingdon Station was still 1 minute and 40 seconds away. He had already calculated everything, and every calculation told him to wait 1 minute and 40 seconds. He stood up. He said nothing when he stood. He didn't straighten his shoulders, didn't look at anyone, didn't do any of the things people usually did when they wanted an entire room to know they had risen. He simply walked forward along the aisle with empty hands, moving with the steps of a man crossing a workshop to fetch a wrench. And it was that very ordinariness that made Petey Gloss retreat half a step, without understanding why. He walked past Curtis Bain. He didn't look at him as he passed. Then he bent down, one knee touching the floor beside Bridget, and reached for a pill that had rolled against the metal ridge. He picked it up between the tips of 2 fingers, carefully, with the care of a man whose hands were far too large for the task he was performing. He placed it in her palm. Then he picked up a second one. Bridget looked up at him, but he didn't look back. He told her quietly, his voice barely carrying above the sound of the iron wheels beneath the floor, to count how many pills were still missing. That was the only thing he said to her throughout that entire night. And later, much later, she would still remember that in that moment, the man didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't ask whether she was hurt, didn't offer her a single comforting word. He gave her something to do. It was the only thing she needed then, and he knew it, though she couldn't understand how he knew. She began to count, 2 pills from his hand, 3 she had already gathered, the cracked container somewhere beneath the seats. Her hands had stopped shaking as badly, because she was counting. He found the 4th pill, placed it in her palm, then rose and turned toward Curtis Bain. He didn't move any closer. He remained exactly where he was, about 1.5 meters away, with both hands resting at his sides. Then he spoke 6 words, and he used the voice of someone reading a train schedule over a station loudspeaker, a voice with nothing in it at all. No threat, no rise, no fall, not even irritation. Next stop. You 3 get off. Silence settled over the train car for about 2 seconds, and during those 2 seconds, if Curtis Bain had been a different man, perhaps everything that happened that night would have ended there. But he wasn't a different man, and he had 2 friends standing behind him. He laughed. He glanced back at Petey, then at Walt, and that backward glance was one of the oldest gestures in the world, the gesture of someone who needed others to confirm that he was still the strongest man there, and he called out to them, asking whether this old man had just given him the train schedule. Petey laughed with him. Walt didn't. Then Brutus stood. The dog didn't bark. It didn't growl. It merely rose from the floor at the rear of the car, slowly, nearly 70 kilograms lifting itself from the ground in the way something truly heavy rises, and stood there. No one had told it to do so. That was what made it frightening. It simply stood at the end of the aisle with its head lowered slightly, breathing. The breathing of a 7-year-old Neapolitan Mastiff, inside an enclosed train car, was something a person heard with the entire body, not merely the ears. Slow, heavy, steady. And Bridget, still kneeling on the floor, felt each breath travel through the rubber and into her knees. The entire car went silent. The boy in the 6th row had removed both sides of his headphones completely. Curtis Bain looked at the dog, and the part of him that was still thinking clearly understood what was happening, but that part of him was too small that night. He said something about the dog, something about its torn ear, about the folds of skin hanging around its neck. A short, filthy remark, the kind of thing a 29-year-old man said so his 2 friends would believe he wasn't afraid, and it was the stupidest thing Curtis Bain had ever said in his life. Then he raised his foot. He wasn't aiming at the dog. It was too far away. He merely kicked in its direction, striking empty air with the gesture of a man driving an animal out of his path. And the gesture needed only to exist. August's hand closed around his ankle in midair. The grip didn't tighten. That was the first thing Curtis Bain noticed, and it struck him as strange before it frightened him. The other man's hand closed around his ankle and held it motionless in the air, without twisting, squeezing, or pulling, applying exactly enough force to stop that leg from moving any farther, and not a fraction more. Curtis tried to pull his leg back. It didn't move. He tried a second time, throwing the weight of his entire body into it, and what he felt wasn't the sensation of dragging one thing away from another. It was the sensation of pulling himself against a wall. He looked into the man's face for the thing he always found on people's faces during nights like this one: anger, contempt, or the tightened expression of someone trying to prove he was brave. None of it was there. The man wasn't looking at him at all. He was looking at the dog, and in the space of about a second and a half, Curtis Bain understood something that made his entire body turn cold from the inside out. Something he would never tell anyone afterward, not even his father's lawyer. This man wasn't holding his leg to protect the dog. The dog didn't need anyone's protection. It stood at the end of the aisle with its head lowered, and at some point it had shifted its weight onto its hind legs, a movement so slight that no one had seen it, but it was there, and that slow, heavy breathing had stopped. The dog was no longer breathing. It was waiting. This man was holding Curtis's leg to keep him back, to keep him on this side of something, and the hand around his ankle wasn't an act against him. It was an act meant to restrain him, and in 30 years of life, no one had ever stopped Curtis Bain for his own good. He couldn't process that. The part of him that understood was too small, while the part that knew he had two friends standing behind him was too large. And when people panic but refuse to appear frightened, they do the oldest thing in the world. They boast. He began talking very quickly. He asked whether the old man knew who he was touching, told him who his father was, told him what his family did, and spoke the name of their demolition company as though it were a weapon. Nothing he said made the hand loosen even slightly. So he went one step farther. He said his family had people at the docks. He said that if the old man had any sense, he would release his leg, because there was someone at the docks who looked after his family. And then he said the man's name. He said it louder than anything else he had said that night, because he was waiting for the name to make something happen. And something did happen. It simply wasn't what Curtis Bain had expected. The hand remained exactly where it was, holding him with exactly the same pressure, not tightening by even the smallest degree. But something else changed, and Bridget Halloran, kneeling on the floor less than 2 meters away with 5 pills in her palm, was the only person in the train car who saw it. She had watched this man's face through 4 stitches, waiting through every one of them for him to flinch, and she had seen nothing. Now she did. It wasn't anger. It passed across his face for about half a second, and disappeared completely, and what remained afterward was calmer than before, flatter, more distant, and that was precisely why it frightened her. She had seen that expression once before, on the face of a colleague the night he was called into a room and told who had been responsible for that day's mistake. It was the expression of someone who had just received a piece of information that would make tomorrow entirely different. Inside August Vance's mind, all the numbers had stopped moving. The name Curtis had spoken belonged to a man August had shared dinner with in March. A man who stood at Pier 4 every Tuesday morning. A man August had personally selected 2 years earlier and approved for compensation that many inside the organization had considered far too generous. He didn't think about revenge. He thought only one thing, the coldest thing of all. If that name had reached the mouth of a drunken 29-year-old kid on a subway train, how many other mouths had it passed through before it reached his? He released Curtis's ankle. He released it carefully, setting the foot down without shoving it, and Curtis stumbled half a step before catching himself. Then August spoke for the second time that night, still using the same voice that sounded as though it were announcing train times. But this time there was a very brief pause between the 2 sentences, and Bridget heard it. "I gave you a way out. I don't make a habit of giving a second one." Curtis Bain didn't hear those words. A person couldn't hear anything in the state he was in then, when only one thought remained inside his head, that his 2 friends were standing there watching as his foot was lowered, like a sack being set down. He swung his arm. The swing was wide and high, the kind thrown by someone who had never truly needed to hit another person, and it passed through the place where August Vance's face had been a fraction of a second earlier. August leaned about 10 centimeters to one side. He didn't step back, didn't raise a hand to block, didn't do anything at all to the blow. He simply wasn't in that place anymore. Then he extended his right palm, placed it in the center of Curtis's chest, and pushed. It was a push. It wasn't a punch. And later, whenever Bridget told anyone about that night, She could never find a way to make them understand the difference between those two things. She only knew that she had seen it, and she knew with absolute certainty that it had been a push. But it carried the full weight of an 85-kilogram man behind it, and Curtis stumbled backward 4 uncontrolled steps across the wet rubber floor before dropping heavily onto the aisle. After that, everything moved very quickly. Walt Tremblay stepped forward. Petey Gloss pulled the backpack from his shoulder, and that was when August Vance saw exactly what he had suspected 10 minutes earlier. The reason he had classified the thin one as dangerous, because Petey's hand disappeared into the backpack and came out holding an iron bar about 1/2 meter long, the kind of trunk support bar sold in any auto parts store, and a man carrying something like that inside a backpack on a subway train near midnight wasn't carrying it to hold up the trunk of a car. At the far end of the train, Dennis Pruitt looked into the right side rearview mirror, as he had done for 30 years, and beneath the yellow light of the last car, he saw one person sitting on the floor of the aisle and another raising something long above his head. 30 years hadn't taught him to think in a moment like that. His hand had already shoved the emergency brake lever before the thinking part of his mind had time to offer an opinion. The train screamed. All 5 cars lurched forward and then stopped, and on the elevated line between Girard and Huntingdon, 8 meters above the street, the 5 train cars stood motionless in the sleet. Then the system did what it had been designed to do. When an elevated train stopped outside a station, the doors locked, every one of them, and they locked so no one could step outside where there was no platform. A small click traveled through the length of the train. The emergency lights at both ends of the car came on in a pale yellow glow, and the final car of the 1140 train became a steel box hanging in the air, with 6 human beings inside and not a single door that could be opened. No one was leaving. No one could call anyone. Not even the 3 men. Bridget Halloran understood that before anyone else in the car. She had been inside a hospital under lockdown twice during her 4 years there, and she knew what that click meant. She didn't get up and run toward the door to test it. She rose and moved in the opposite direction, toward the rear, to the second row, and took Iola Bendix by the elbow. She didn't explain anything. She only said, "Come with me," in a low and steady voice, the voice she used when leading someone away from a hallway where they shouldn't be standing, and Mrs. Iola followed her, because there were certain voices people followed without asking questions. At the 6th row, Bridget held out her hand, and the 15-year-old boy stood immediately, carrying his headphones with him and saying nothing. She led both of them to the connecting door at the rear of the car. The latch on that door had been loose since the previous winter, and it opened when she drove her shoulder against it. She guided them into the next car, both of them stepping across the gap where the 2 cars joined, and then she closed the door again. She closed it from this side. She didn't think about it, didn't weigh the decision, didn't pause even half a second to calculate what she had just chosen, because during 4 years the order had already been written into her: get the people who couldn't save themselves out first, then go after them, and that order left no room for questions. She remained on this side of the door, pressed her back against it, and stretched both hands behind her until they touched the cold metal. In the middle of the car, August Vance bent down. He reached for Brutus's leather collar, found the brass clasp, and opened it. Inside a train car that had suddenly fallen completely silent, the sound of the metal clasp slipping free from the ring was dry, brief, and unmistakably clear. He straightened, the loose chain hanging from his hand, and spoke the last words he would say to those 3 men that night. "You can sit down and remain quiet, or you'll understand why I don't need a leash." Bridget didn't turn around. That was the decision she had made while closing the door, and she held to it, keeping her eyes fixed on the small window in the door behind her, where Mrs. Iola and the boy stood in the next car, while both of Bridget's hands remained stretched behind her against the cold metal, covering the part of the door someone might try to push open. The glass had fogged with condensation. She could see 2 shadows on the other side and nothing more clearly than that, and she left it that way. She listened. The first thing she heard was a short, hard sound, the sound of metal leaving someone's hand, and she knew it was the iron bar because she had seen it before closing the door. It didn't fall immediately. There was a tiny pause between that hard sound and the moment it struck the floor, and during that pause, she realized she had thought of Rowan. Not any particular thought, only his face, and she forced herself to count. She counted because it was the only thing she knew how to do, with both hands stretched behind her and her eyes forbidden to turn around. The second sound came almost at once, and it wasn't hard. It was heavy and dull, the sound of one large mass driving into another, and the train car trembled beneath her feet, the vibration traveling up through the rubber floor, just as the dog's breathing had traveled into her knees a few minutes earlier. Someone shouted, one short cry, and it wasn't the cry of someone who had been injured. It was the cry of someone who had suddenly lost his footing, and the part of Bridget's mind that had spent 4 years in the emergency room knew the difference immediately, without waiting for her permission. The third sound was the smallest of the three. It was only fabric scraping against plastic and someone releasing one hard breath, the breath of a person who had just sat down without choosing to. Then it was over. She waited for a fourth sound. She stood there with both hands stretched behind her and waited. But no fourth sound came. Silence rushed back into the train car far more quickly than she had expected, so quickly that she had no time to prepare for it. And inside that silence, she heard things she hadn't been able to hear before. The sleet striking the glass overhead, the faint buzzing of the emergency light at the end of the car, and the air compressor somewhere beneath the train starting up and then falling silent again. She counted to 4. She had begun counting at the first sound, and she had only reached 4. Bridget turned around. The iron bar was still rolling. It moved very slowly across the wet rubber floor, following the slight tilt of the train car where it stood on the elevated track, passing through a band of fluorescent light and then beyond it, and it still hadn't reached the legs of the seats on the opposite side. She watched it roll, and the fact that it was still moving made her understand that everything had happened in less time than it took an iron bar to cross an aisle. The 3 men were sitting on the floor, leaning against the legs of the seats, all 3 of them, and no one was standing. No one said a word. Petey Gloss was clutching one arm against his chest, and he wasn't looking at anyone. He stared at the floor between his knees. The man stood in the middle of the aisle with both hands lowered at his sides, the chain still hanging from his left hand, and the dog had lain down. It rested at his feet, with its head on its front paws, its sides rising and falling with the same slow, heavy breathing it had maintained throughout the ride. And if Bridget had entered the car at that exact moment, she would have sworn the animal had never stood up once that night. August. Vance stood in the middle of the aisle and looked down at his right hand. It was trembling. Not much, only at the tips of his fingers. The kind of tremor another person standing 2 meters away wouldn't have noticed. But he noticed it, and he knew exactly what it was. It wasn't fear, nor was it the thing some men he had known used to seek out in moments like this one, the thing that made their eyes shine and made them talk more than usual after everything was over. It was chemistry. It was his body flooding his bloodstream with everything it had needed for the last 4 seconds, then pulling it all away again, and the body forced to endure that surge and withdrawal was 34 years old now, and had done this too many times. He closed his eyes for exactly a fraction of a second. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Hold for 4. He had learned that rhythm of breathing in a place where people taught it to keep a man's hands steady enough to shoot, and he had used it for that purpose for 12 years, then continued using it for 3 more years for something entirely different. For mornings when he woke at 4 o'clock with his heart pounding in his throat, and nothing in the bedroom except a wardrobe and a snoring dog, that rhythm didn't take anything away. It only kept his hands still enough that no one had time to notice. By the 3rd breath, the trembling had stopped. And during those 3 breaths, the thing that truly disturbed him finally arrived. And it wasn't the 3 young men sitting on the floor. He hated moments like this. He had hated them for a long time, since before he even knew he hated them. But he didn't hate them because they were heavy, or because they were difficult. The real problem was that they weren't difficult at all. During the last 4 seconds, he hadn't needed to think even once. There hadn't been a single moment when he had needed to choose, weigh anything, or remember. His body knew where to move. His hands knew what to do with the iron bar. And the part of his mind that measured distances and counted exits had arranged everything 10 minutes earlier, and all of it had merely been waiting for someone to open the door and let it out. It came out smoothly. It came out more easily than tightening a bolt to precisely the right torque. That was where the pain lived. For 3 years, he had taken this train 3 nights a week, with no car, no companion, and no phone in his pocket. And he had continued telling himself that he rode it for another reason. But there was another reason he had never spoken aloud, not even to himself. And tonight, it had been dragged into the middle of a subway aisle beneath fluorescent lights. He rode that train to prove something. That a man could sit inside a steel box with 5 strangers for 40 minutes and step out at the other end without doing anything at all. More than 310 times, he had proved it. And the 4 seconds tonight had erased every one of those times. Not because he had done something wrong, because he knew he hadn't, but because during those 4 seconds he had returned to the place where he belonged too quickly, too easily, too perfectly, like a key sliding into the lock made for it. 3 years hadn't repaired anything. 3 years had merely been 3 years with that key lying in his pocket. He opened his eyes. The 3 men remained seated on the floor, none of them intending to stand, and he didn't look down at them again for the rest of the night. He spoke to the dog. He said, "Brutus, heel," and the voice he used for those 2 words had nothing to do with the train announcement voice the 3 men had heard. It softened completely. It was almost gentle, the way someone might wake a sleeping child for school, and Bridget Halloran, standing 4 meters away with her back still pressed against the connecting door, heard those 2 words and felt something inside her chest turn. During the last 15 minutes, she had seen more than enough reasons to fear this man. The thing that made her stop fearing him was the 2 words he spoke to a dog. Brutus didn't need to be called a second time. Somehow, it was already standing, and it moved to August's left side, taking the place where it always stood, its ears neither lowered nor its tail moving, showing absolutely no sign that there was any difference between this train car now and the same train car 40 minutes earlier. August bent down. He found the ring on the leather collar, slipped the brass clasp through it, and pressed until it clicked into place. Then he extended his thumb and tapped twice against the leather. The dog shifted one ear slightly backward. "We're still here. Everything's fine." Dennis Pruitt had been sitting inside his cabin for 2 minutes, with one hand resting on the radio without pressing it, his eyes fixed on the right side rearview mirror. 30 years of driving night trains had taught him to read a train car through a mirror the way other people read a page. He saw 3 men sitting on the floor. He saw a man standing in the middle of the aisle, with both hands lowered at his sides, and a dog beside his leg. He saw the young woman in a nurse's uniform, leaning against the connecting door at the rear, and he had seen everything that came before it as well. He had seen the 3 men board at Somerset Station. He had seen them walk through 4 empty cars. He had seen who raised a hand first and who lifted the iron bar, because that mirror showed him everything, and because he had been looking into it for 30 years. He knew what had happened on his train that night, and he knew the order in which it had happened. He released the safety lock and let the train crawl along the final stretch of track at the speed of a person walking, and he kept it moving that slowly for longer than necessary. When the train reached Huntingdon Station, he did 2 things almost at once. He opened the doors and pressed the red button, and he did them in that order rather than the other way around. And later, when people asked, he said he had followed procedure. 30 seconds. That was all he gave them, and he never told anyone that he had given it. August Vance stepped onto the platform at Huntingdon, with the dog beside his left leg, and he was already walking toward the stairs leading down to the street, before the first siren could be heard from the direction of Kensington Avenue. He didn't walk quickly. People remembered a man who hurried. He was only a mechanic coming off a night shift, descending the station stairs through the sleet with a dog, and 30 seconds later there was no one like that left on the platform. 2 police officers entered the last car 4 minutes afterward. Bridget Halloran stood in the middle of the car with the uniform bag she had recovered hanging from her shoulder, and answered their questions in her steady voice. And she answered them clearly, calmly, and she lied. She said the 3 men had fought among themselves. She said they had been drinking when they boarded, that they had started arguing. Then one of them had pulled out the iron bar, and everything had happened very quickly. The officer asked whether anyone else had been inside the car. She said there had been an elderly woman and a boy, but she had moved them into the next car before anything happened. The officer wrote it down. She didn't understand why she was saying those things. She stood there listening to her own voice form the words, while the part of her that counted every pill before entering a patient's room was screaming that she wasn't a person who lied, that she had signed her name on more forms than she could remember during 4 years, and had never written a single false line, and that part of her received no answer at all. The only thing she thought about as she spoke was that slight shake of his head, only once. "Don't say anything." The officer asked whether she was injured. She said no, and she said it without looking over her own body, then stepped past him and left the car, walking to where Mrs. Iola Bendix sat on a bench on the platform. Bridget took the woman's right hand and turned her arm upward beneath the light. A bruise about 4 centimeters long marked the inside of her forearm, where she had struck the edge of the seat when someone yanked her netted shopping bag. Bridget pressed 2 fingertips lightly against the edge of the bruise, asked whether it hurt when she bent her arm, told her to try bending it, then said it was nothing serious, that it would turn yellow within 3 days, and that she only needed to apply something cold that night. Mrs. Iola looked at her. Then she said she didn't need to apply anything, and she asked Bridget whether someone was waiting for her at home. Later, when the list was compiled of everything found inside the last car of the 11:40 train that night, it included an iron bar, a backpack, 11 coins beneath the second row of seats, and 7 pills. It didn't include the container. Before leaving the car, August Vance had bent down one final time and picked it up from the floor, the empty plastic container with a crack along the edge of its lid, then slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't know what it had once held. He didn't know what condition it treated, how much it cost, or whether it was something a person might die without. On the front of the container, directly beneath the printed label, there was a line handwritten in black marker over the faded traces of older writing, the round, hurried handwriting of someone who had written that same line once a week for many years. Rowan. Morning. That was all he knew. There was someone named Rowan, and there was someone else who cared for him enough to take out a marker every week and write on a plastic container. The room behind the auto shop in Fishtown contained only a steel table, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet no one had ever opened in front of an outsider, and Sal DeMeo remained standing rather than sitting, holding a printed sheet he had carried in his hand for 20 minutes. He was 2 years short of 70, and he spoke very slowly, because he had learned long ago that when a man spoke slowly, everyone else had to listen. He said the camera in the last car truly was broken. It had been out of service since October, exactly as August had said, and as of that morning it still hadn't been repaired, which meant not a single frame had been recorded inside that train car the night before. Then he placed the sheet on the steel table and pushed it forward. Huntingdon Station had 4 cameras, and all 4 of them were working. Printed on the page was a grainy black and white frame taken from above, showing a man in a suede jacket walking toward the stairs leading down to the street at 12:14 in the morning. His face wasn't clear. There was nothing distinctive about the jacket, but walking beside his left leg, maintaining exactly the same distance in both consecutive frames, was a dog whose back reached a man's hip, thick-bodied and broad-headed, weighing nearly 70 kilograms, and there weren't many Neapolitan Mastiffs in the city of Philadelphia riding the subway after midnight, Sal said. 3 years. For 3 years he had pleaded, argued, and nearly dropped to his knees, begging August not to take that train. And in the end, the thing that exposed him wasn't a cop, an informant, or a recording device. It was the dog, the only living thing in the house he hadn't been able to leave behind. August Vance sat on the opposite side of the steel table, and he didn't look at the photograph for more than 2 seconds. He gave Sal 3 instructions, and he gave them in order without explaining any of them. The first concerned the man at Pier 4, and August wanted to know how many families that man had taken money from during the past 2 years, and he wanted the answer before Friday. The second concerned the 3 men on the train, their full names, their addresses, and what their families did for a living. The third concerned a company called Meridian Recovery, and he wanted to know what it bought, whom it bought from, and how much it paid. Sal DeMeo stopped at the third name. He asked what it was. August said it was a debt collection company. Sal watched him for a long time, then sat down, and his voice changed completely. No longer the voice of a man delivering information, but the voice of an uncle. He asked whether August intended to play hero for a nurse whose name he didn't even know. He said he had heard many foolish things in 40 years, but never anything more foolish than that. He asked whether August understood who he was, whether he knew that 11 men would be sitting at the long table the following week, men who had waited 3 years for a piece of paper like the one lying between them. And August Vance said the thing he had carried inside himself for 3 years, the thing he had never told Sal DeMeo, and had never told anyone. He said Emmett died on that train. Sal DeMeo fell silent. August continued, very calmly, in the voice of a man reciting something he had repeated inside his mind too many times to feel anything while saying it aloud. The 11:40 train, the last car, the row of seats against the rear wall. His brother had been sitting in that exact place, and they had found him in that exact place. And for the past 3 years, August had never taken that train because he wanted to be an ordinary man, even though he had allowed Sal to believe that, and had tried to make himself believe it too. He took that train because it was the last place in the world where his brother was still alive. He sat in that seat because 40 minutes at a time meant 40 minutes in the same place as Emmett, and nowhere else in the world could give him that. not even the cemetery at Holy Sepulchre, where he hadn't returned since the second winter. Sal DeMeo placed both hands on the steel table and stared down at them for a long time. Then he said the sentence August would continue hearing inside his head for many weeks afterward. He said, "You aren't saving her, son. You're trying to save the part of yourself you thought you buried with your brother." They said nothing more about it. Sal DeMeo left, and 3 days later he returned. And he returned at 5 o'clock on Thursday evening rather than Friday, something that had never happened in 40 years. He closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down. He said those 3 men hadn't been there by chance. They had been hired. Someone had paid them to board the last car of the 11:40 train and cause trouble. And the person who paid them hadn't hired them to kill anyone, hadn't hired them to take anything from anyone, and hadn't mentioned a nurse at all, because no one had known there would be a nurse on the train that night. They had been hired to do only one thing: record it. Meridian Recovery's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Walnut Street, and August Vance walked in at 5 minutes before 6 o'clock on Tuesday evening, wearing the same clothes he had worn all afternoon beneath a truck, with oil on his hands and oil on his knees. He brought no one with him. He carried nothing. Brutus lay down in the hallway beside the elevator doors, and the receptionist came out, looked at him, then went back inside without saying a word. Randall Feeney sat behind a clean wooden desk with 3 framed family photographs arranged in a row, and he asked August whether he had an appointment. August sat in the chair across from him and didn't answer. He remained silent for 40 seconds. In a room with a softly running air conditioner and a clock hanging on the wall, 40 seconds was a very long time. Feeney said one thing, then a second, then stopped speaking, because the man sitting before him wasn't being rude or threatening in any way. He was simply waiting, and nothing in Feeney's 40 years in the business had taught him how to deal with a man who was willing to wait. Then August spoke. He recited the names of 3 companies in a single breath, without looking at a piece of paper. 3 names so dull that no one would remember them, though a search through the Delaware Business Registry would show that all 3 were registered to the same post office box in Wilmington. He stated the amount Meridian had paid to purchase the Halloran account from St. Ambrose Hospital, 4 cents on the dollar. He said the number slowly and clearly, then added that the letter sent to her demanded $61,000. Feeney began to explain. He explained that it was standard practice in the industry, that the buyer assumed all the risk, that most accounts never yielded a single dollar, and he said all of it in the courteous voice he had used for 20 years, a voice that had never failed him before. August allowed him to finish. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed exactly one thing on the wooden desk: a small printed sheet bearing a grainy black and white photograph taken from above an elevated train platform. He said nothing about it. He merely turned it so that it faced the right direction, then withdrew his hand. Randall Feeney looked at the photograph. It showed 3 men being escorted across Huntington Station by 2 police officers, and the man walking in the middle, the only one of the 3 whose face was turned directly toward the camera, was his younger sister's son. Feeney didn't ask why August had the photograph. He didn't ask who August was either, and that was the most revealing thing of all, because people only refrained from asking when they already knew. He sat very still with both hands resting on the desk, and for about a minute and a half, no one in the room spoke. Then he opened a drawer and removed a stack of documents. August purchased the Halloran account for 8 cents on the dollar, twice what Meridian had paid, and he made the payment through a fund bearing the name of a South Philadelphia parish that had been closed since 2009. The entire transaction cost $4,880. Feeney signed in 3 places. Not a single threat was spoken that entire afternoon. No one raised his voice. No one stood up. And later, that was what kept Randall Feeney awake through more nights than anything else. Before leaving, August asked him one question. He asked how many more accounts like this one were stored in his filing cabinets, and he said he was asking sincerely. Feeney pointed toward the row of cabinets along the wall. He said he didn't know. He said no one had ever counted them. August walked over. He opened the second drawer, the one labeled Kensington, and began searching through it. He searched because he wanted to see what an account like the girl's looked like when it was filed among all the others. And instead he found something else. In the middle of the drawer, wedged between 2 beige folders, was a closed file, and the label identified the person who had paid the accounts. The name was Emmett Vance. August removed it. Inside were 23 accounts, 23 names, 23 addresses, in Kensington and Port Richmond. Every one of them was medical debt. Every one had been purchased and erased during a period of roughly 7 months, 3 years earlier, and every payment had been made by transfer from a personal bank account whose number August had seen on the estate documents after his brother's death. There was no organization named anywhere in the file, no fund, no shell, no church that had been closed since 2009. Emmett Vance had put his own name on every payment. August stood before the open filing cabinet, holding 23 names in his hands. And for about 30 seconds, everything he had believed for 3 years broke apart and rearranged itself into a different shape. He had been told that his brother died because of business. He had been told about Pier 7, about the contract that year, about the names he had spent his first 2 years searching for. Not one of the 40 men who sat at that long table had ever told him that Emmett had spent his own money on 23 families he had never met and told no one, not even his own brother. August understood the reason while he was still standing there. In the house he now led, there was something more frightening than losing money, and that was a man at the top, beginning to spend money on acts of kindness. They called that going soft. His brother hadn't been shot because of a dock. His brother had been shot for doing exactly what August had done on that same train, 4 days earlier. August Vance didn't need anyone to investigate further to know who had paid those 3 men. He had known while he was still standing in front of the filing cabinet on Walnut Street, because in that entire organization, there was only one person who knew which train he took, which car he sat in, and which nights of the week he rode, and that person had spent 3 years begging him not to go. He arranged to meet Sal DeMeo at Buona Notte on Passyunk Street, the restaurant where the two of them had eaten since August was 13 years old, at the same 4th table from the window, beneath the same checkered tablecloth. He brought no one with him. He ordered 2 plates of pasta and didn't eat a single bite. He simply stated 3 things, never raising his voice and never asking a question, while Sal DeMeo listened with both hands resting on the tablecloth exactly as they had rested on the steel table a few days earlier. August said he had found the file at Meridian. He said he had read all 23 names. Then he said he knew who had paid the 3 men on the train, that he knew they had been hired to record him, and that he knew the footage would be brought before the long table to prove to 11 men that he was still the thing he had always been. Sal DeMeo didn't deny a single word. He remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and what he said wasn't an excuse. He said he had held Emmett in his arms when Emmett was 3 days old. He said he had been the one forced to enter the morgue that night because the boy's father had been dead since 1994, and there had been no one else old enough to do it. He said he had known about those 23 names before Emmett died. He had known, and he had told Emmett to stop, had told him 4 times, and Emmett had laughed and said, "You worry too much, Uncle Sal." Then he said the words August would carry with him for the rest of his life. He said, "For 3 years, I've waited every night for the phone to ring." He said, "I've sat in my house for 3 years waiting to hear that you had started going soft too. And the night I heard what happened on that train, I knew it had finally come, and I would rather drag you out of that seat with my own hands than walk into that morgue a second time." The man, who was 2 years short of 70, sat at the 4th table from the window inside Buona Notte and began to cry halfway through, without making a sound, his shoulders trembling as one hand rose to cover his eyes, and the waiter passed beside him and kept walking without asking anything. August Vance sat there without speaking for a full minute. He didn't take revenge. He didn't say a word about what should be done to the man who had hired those 3, and in the world where he lived, that silence was a decision the 11 men at the long table would never understand. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand over the old man's, and he said, "Retire, Uncle Sal. Starting tonight." He said it very softly, and he knew exactly what he was doing, because Sal DeMeo had no wife, no children, no vacation home in Jersey, nothing from 40 years except this work and the 4th table from the window, and of all the things August could have done to him, this was the heaviest one he could imagine. Sal DeMeo understood. He nodded once, then stood, put on his coat, and walked out of the restaurant, and that was the last time those 2 men ever sat at the same table. At about the same time, on the 3rd floor of St. Ambrose Hospital, Bridget Halloran opened an envelope in the changing room at 7:10 in the morning, after a 12-hour shift. At the top of the page was the company's name, printed in a typeface that looked very much like the kind used by respectable places. In the middle of the page were 2 zeros. Remaining balance, $0. Account status, closed. She read it once and didn't understand. She read it a second time, and thought someone had sent it to the wrong address. She read it a third time, slowly, line by line, including the small print at the bottom. And then she sat down on the changing room floor, with her back against her metal locker, and cried. She cried the way someone cried after not crying for 4 years, without making a sound, both hands covering her mouth, her entire body trembling, and it lasted far longer than she wanted it to. Marguerite Okonjo opened the door sometime in the middle of it. She didn't ask anything. She didn't say a single word. She simply closed the door again, walked over, and sat on the floor beside Bridget, a woman in her 60s lowering herself onto the tiled floor in her uniform, and she remained there until Bridget stopped. 3 weeks later, a patient in room 412 told her, at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, that a company had been calling her twice every week. The woman mentioned the company's name. Bridget stood still with the medication tray in her hands. Then, during the following 10 days, 2 more people told her the same thing, both during the night shift, both at the hour when people no longer had enough strength to keep anything to themselves. She didn't search a single medical record. She didn't have the authority, and she didn't need to. She simply began writing down, inside a small notebook she bought at the drugstore, the things people chose to tell her at 3 o'clock in the morning. 3 weeks after that night, at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning, when Bridget Halloran walked out through the East Staff entrance of St. Ambrose Hospital after a 12-hour shift, a dog was sitting on the sidewalk across the street. It was sitting there alone. Rain was falling, the fine, relentless rain of February, and its ash-gray coat had darkened with the wet. Yet it remained there, perfectly still, both front legs straight, staring at the door Bridget had just stepped through, as though it had known in advance which entrance she would use. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. The security guard at the desk told her the animal had been sitting there since before 5 o'clock, that he had gone outside to check on it twice, and that it wouldn't allow him to come near, though it hadn't done anything either. Bridget crossed the street. She lowered herself in front of the dog until they were at eye level, and it didn't move a single millimeter. On its leather collar, beside the brass ring she had once seen beneath the fluorescent lights of a train car, there was now a small brass tag, new and still shining, and the tag bore no owner's name and no telephone number, only an address, a street number on Frankfurt Street in Fishtown. She read it 3 times. Then she understood that the man hadn't dared to send her a message himself, so he had sent this instead. The auto shop in Fishtown opened at 7 o'clock in the morning, and Bridget arrived at 9. August Vance was lying beneath a pickup truck, and he knew she had entered the yard while she was still 15 meters from the gate, because he was still the man who counted exits and measured distances, and he didn't come out. He remained beneath the truck, with a wrench in his hand. She stood beside the front wheel, and told him she had found out who he was. From beneath the truck, he answered in an even voice that she should go home. Then, she said she was a pediatric oncology nurse. She said she held children's hands during the most frightening moments of their lives, that she had done it for 4 years, and she asked whether he truly believed she was afraid of him. There was no answer from beneath the truck. She placed 2 things on the hood, a box of powdered donuts rather than the yeast-raised kind, and a sheet of paper. The paper was a hospital invoice form she had taken from the administrative office. She had written his name herself in the patient section, then filled in a line for services that read 4 stitches to the right hand and 1 train ride home, and in the total section she had written in capital letters, paid in full. Then she left. He came out from beneath the truck, only after the sound of her footsteps had reached the gate. Rowan Halloran met Brutus on Sunday afternoon the following week, in the small yard behind the shop, and the 16-year-old boy wasn't afraid of the nearly 70-kilogram animal for even a second. He raised his fist to his mouth like a microphone and began commentating from the very first moment, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a historic afternoon. The heaviest competitor in the history of the league has just entered the field, and he is moving very slowly, extremely slowly. He sees absolutely no reason to move any faster." Rowan gave the dog a private nickname in less than a minute. He called him His Honor and announced to the entire yard that the dog looked exactly like his former middle school principal, with the same expression as someone who had heard every excuse in the world and hadn't believed a single one. Brutus walked over, stood looking at him for a moment, then lowered his enormous head into Rowan's lap and released a very long sigh. August Vance stood in the doorway of the shop about 10 meters away, and he smiled. It was the first time. Rowan was the only person in this entire story who treated him like an ordinary man from the very first second. Not because he was kinder than anyone else, but but because he didn't know who August was and couldn't see why it should matter. 1 year later, on another February night, Bridget Halloran sat aboard the 11:40 Market Frankfurt train in the final car, and the row of seats against the rear wall across from her remained empty. It was always left empty. She had ridden this train more than 310 times during the past year, and not once had anyone sat there. She opened an unsigned envelope with no return address that had appeared in her mailbox that morning. Inside was a list. The first section contained 23 names and 23 addresses in Kensington and Port Richmond, all of them closed 3 years earlier. The second section contained 23 more names, newer ones, and she recognized every single one because each of those people had told her their story at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning during the past year, and she had written every name in the small notebook she had bought at the drugstore. And now beside every one of them was a line stating that the account had been closed. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten sentence in the heavy, square writing of someone whose hand was too large for the pen. 46. My brother would have liked that number. She raised her eyes and looked out the window. The train was passing through the southern stretch, where the tracks curved close to the container yards at the docks, and beneath the orange glow of the high-pressure lights spilling over rows of steel containers, stacked 3 levels high, there was the silhouette of a man sitting on the roof of a truck with an ash-gray dog lying beside him. 3 nights a week, at this exact time. He no longer rode the train, and never would again. He simply sat there and watched it pass. Bridget raised her hand and pressed it against the window. The train continued onward. Kindness rarely comes from the place where we expect to find it, and sometimes what saves a human being isn't someone stronger, but simply someone willing not to look away. We can't choose what life takes from us, but every night, inside the train car that belongs to each of us, we are all given one choice: to stand up or remain seated. If this story touched you, please leave a like so I'll know you're still listening, and subscribe to our channel so we can share new stories together every day. How did tonight's story make you feel? And if you had been sitting in that train car, would you have stood up or remained seated? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear what lies deep within your hearts. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story tonight, please send it to them. I wish everyone watching this video lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.